The Duke of Harrow was not supposed to stop in Alveston. He was travelling north, passing through the village on the way to his estate in Yorkshire. And the only reason his carriage slowed at all was that a wheel had developed a rattle that his coachman wanted to examine before the road got worse. It was a 15-minute stop, perhaps 20. The kind of pause that leaves no mark on a journey and is forgotten before the traveller has reached his destination. Except that in those 15 minutes, standing outside a coaching inn while his coachman investigated the wheel, Edmund Ashby, the 7th Duke of Harrow, watched something happen that he did not forget. Not in 3 years, not ever. The village green was small and ordinary, the kind of green that every English village had, with a pump and a bench and a spreading oak that had been there longer than anyone could remember. A young woman was crossing it, alone, carrying a stack of books, with the focused efficiency of someone going somewhere with purpose. She was perhaps 22, dark-haired, neat, dressed plainly but well. Not beautiful in the way that announced itself, but there was something in the way she moved, something self-contained and certain that made you look. The carriage that pulled up alongside her was expensive. The women inside it were expensively dressed. There were 3 of them, and they had the particular quality of women who have spent their entire lives being the most important people in every room they enter, and who enforce this belief on the surrounding landscape. He heard what they said. He was close enough to hear every word. He watched the young woman with the books stand very still while they said it. He watched her chin come up, a small, precise movement, barely visible. He watched her say nothing, because there was nothing to say that would have been heard, and she was clearly wise enough to know it. He watched the carriage move on. He watched her stand in the middle of the village green for exactly 3 seconds, alone, still, with the books in her arms and the words hanging in the air around her, and then resume walking at exactly the same pace as before, as though nothing had happened at all. He stood outside the coaching inn and felt something he could not immediately name. His coachman appeared at his elbow. The wheel was fine. They could continue. He got back in the carriage. He did not stop in Alveston again, but he thought about her. In the particular, involuntary way that certain things lodge in the mind and refuse to leave. The image of her standing in the green, chin lifted, holding her ground against something she could not fight. He thought about her for 3 years. And then, on a September morning, he came back to Alveston. Miss Eleanor Voss had been the schoolteacher of Alveston for 4 years. She had taken the position at 21, which was young for the work, but the village had been without a teacher for 2 years following old Mr. Hartley's retirement, and Eleanor had been the only applicant who could demonstrate, clearly and without embellishment, that she was qualified to do it. She had been educated at her father's knee. Her father, the Reverend George Voss, had believed firmly that the education of daughters was not merely acceptable, but obligatory. And she had continued her own education through the considerable library he had left behind. The Reverend George Voss had been, by all accounts, a fine scholar and a devoted pastor. He had also, in his 63rd year, made a series of financial decisions so catastrophically misjudged that he had died, leaving debts that consumed the vicarage, the furniture, the library, and the last of his daughter's expectations, in that order. The library had been the thing Eleanor mourned most. She had watched those books go, one by one, with the specific grief of someone losing old friends. She had not mourned the expectations. She had never had a great many, and the ones she'd had were more her mother's than hers. Her mother, who had died when Eleanor was 16, had been the daughter of a minor baronet. a connection that had given the family a veneer of gentility without any of the substance, and which had, in Eleanor's experience, caused more problems than it solved. It had meant that the villagers of Alveston considered her slightly above them, without any of the people above considering her anything at all. It was a thoroughly uncomfortable position, and she had arrived at the practical conclusion, sometime around her 20th year, that she should simply ignore it and get on with being useful. The school was useful. There were 32 children in it, ranging from 6 to 14, and Eleanor knew each of them with the particular intimacy of someone who had spent 4 years watching them grow. She knew who was clever and had not been told so. She knew who struggled and why. She knew which parents supported the school and which considered it an interruption to the more important business of agricultural labour. She had managed, through a combination of genuine skill and stubborn persistence, to increase attendance by half since she arrived. She had also, through the same combination, persuaded the village council to replace the school's roof, which had been letting in weather in a way that made learning considerably more difficult. She was, in short, very good at her job. She was also, by the general consensus of a certain kind of person, an object of mild pity. The clergyman's daughter who had come down in the world, the girl who had been educated above her station, and had therefore become neither one thing nor the other. Too learned for the farmers' wives, and too poor for the gentry, occupying the uncomfortable middle distance of a woman who did not quite fit anywhere. She had, over 4 years, developed a robust indifference to this assessment, or something that functioned like indifference most of the time. On the morning of the 3rd of September, she was walking back from the school to her cottage, a small, clean, well-ordered place at the edge of the village that she had made as close to comfortable as a modest teacher's salary allowed, when she became aware of a carriage she did not recognize moving slowly along the village road. It was a very good carriage, the kind that did not ordinarily appear in Alveston except in summer, when the families with estates in the surrounding countryside occasionally passed through on their way to somewhere more important. She did not pay it particular attention. She had books to mark and a letter to write, and a leak in the school's eastern window that needed addressing before the autumn rains properly arrived. She did not look up as it passed. She did not see the man inside it looking out. She did not know that he had been here before. She did not know that he remembered her. Edmund Ashby had a reason for coming back to Alveston. It was a legitimate reason. His estate at Ashby Park was 12 miles north, and the village school had been identified in a report by his land steward as one that might benefit from the endowment scheme the Duke had been developing for rural education across his properties. 3 schools in 3 villages, properly funded, with materials and a small supplementary income for their teachers. It was a project he had been planning for 2 years. Alveston was on the list. Had been on the list since before he remembered why he knew the name. When his steward mentioned it, and the name of the teacher, Miss Eleanor Voss, 4 years in post, attendance significantly improved, reputation among the village families universally excellent, Edmund had sat for a moment with the paper in his hands and thought, "There she is." He had not told his steward this. He had simply said that he would handle the Alveston visit himself, which his steward had noted with mild surprise, as the Duke generally delegated initial visits to educational institutions. Edmund had not explained. He arrived on a Tuesday. The school was in session when he reached it. He could hear it from the road, the particular orchestrated sound of young voices reciting something in unison that resolved, as he got closer, into a passage from Shakespeare that he recognized. The door was open. He stopped in the doorway. The room was ordinary. the standard equipment of a village schoolroom: 2 long tables and benches, a blackboard covered in neat writing, windows on the south side letting in the September light. 30-odd children of varying ages were arranged in groups, some reciting, some writing, some listening to a smaller group read aloud in the corner. And at the front of the room, with a piece of chalk in her hand and her back to the door, was Eleanor Voss. She was exactly as he remembered. Dark hair, neat dress, the quality of self-contained certainty in the way she stood. She was writing something on the board and talking as she wrote, and the children were listening with the focused attention that meant they were genuinely engaged, not performing engagement. She turned. She saw him in the doorway. He saw the exact moment of recognition, not of him specifically, but of the quality of him, the carriage outside, the clothes, the category. The almost imperceptible lift of her chin that he recognized from 3 years ago on the village green. "School is in session," she said pleasantly. "If you wish to speak with me, I ask that you wait until the dinner hour. I will be available at 12 o'clock. He was not accustomed to being told to wait. He waited. He sat on the bench outside the school door for 45 minutes and listened to the sound of teaching happening inside, and thought several things, and arrived at 12 o'clock in a state of mind that he would not have been able to entirely account for. She came out of the school with the chalk still on her fingers and looked at him with the direct, assessing gaze of a woman who was deciding what she thought. "You are from Ashby Park," she said, not a question. "I am the Duke of Harrow," he said. "Edmund Ashby. I know who you are." She sat on the bench he had vacated with the comfortable ease of someone in their own territory. "You want to discuss the endowment scheme. Mr. Peters mentioned it was under consideration." "I do," he said. He sat on the other end of the bench. "I've been reviewing the report on the school. Your attendance figures are impressive." "They are the result of 4 years of work," she said. "The figures impress people who don't know what went into them. The children impress me more." He looked at her. "Tell me about them." She looked back at him with a slightly different quality, assessing, recalibrating. "Why?" she said. "Because the endowment is meant to benefit them. I would like to understand what benefit means, specifically, in this context." She studied him for a moment longer. Then she told him. She talked for 20 minutes, about the children, specifically, by name, with the particular precision of someone who had been paying close attention for 4 years, about what they needed and what the school currently couldn't provide, about the boy in the back row who had a talent for mathematics that was going to waste because there was no one to take him further than Eleanor's own knowledge, about the girl who could not see the board clearly and whose parents could not afford spectacles, and who had been struggling for 2 years because of something that cost 3 shillings to fix. Edmund listened. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he said, "The spectacles. That can be addressed this week." She looked at him. "And the rest," he said, "I would like to discuss properly. Would you be willing to meet again, tomorrow, if that suits, to go through the specifics of what the school needs?" "Yes," she said. "Straightforward. No performance. Tomorrow at 12. He stood. He was very aware, in a way he had not entirely planned for, of how close the bench was, and how direct her eyes were, and the chalk dust still on her fingers. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace." He walked back to his carriage. He came back the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the first week, the endowment had been agreed in principle, and 3 pairs of spectacles had been ordered from the optician in the nearest town. And Edmund Ashby had arrived at the uncomfortable but entirely clear recognition that he had not come back to Alveston solely for the school. Alveston noticed everything. It was the particular talent of small villages to observe, catalogue, and distribute information with a speed and accuracy that would have impressed any intelligence service. And the appearance of the Duke of Harrow's carriage outside the village school 3 days running had not gone unremarked. By Thursday, every household in Alveston was aware that the Duke had visited the school twice and was expected again. By Friday, the interpretations had diverged along predictable lines. The farming families, who liked Eleanor and thought her fairly treated by almost no one, took a cautious but not unfriendly interest. The small number of gentry families in the surrounding area, who had always found Eleanor's presence in the village somewhat anomalous, took a sharper and less friendly interest. Eleanor was aware of all of this. She could feel the shift in the air, the way you feel a change in weather. Not visible yet, but present. A pressure difference. Something coming. She was also aware, with the methodical honesty she applied to her own internal accounting, of what was happening in herself. She had met men with power before. She had dealt with them, the village council, the local magistrate, the occasional landowner who passed through, with the practical competence of a woman who had learned to get things done in systems that were not designed for her. She knew how to be useful to powerful men without becoming dependent on them. She knew how to hold her position without making enemies of people she needed. She did not know what to do with Edmund Ashby. He was not what she had expected. She had expected, she acknowledged honestly, a version of condescension dressed up as benevolence. The particular kind of interest that wealthy men sometimes took in improving projects, which was really interest in their own improving impulses rather than in the project itself. Instead, she had found someone who listened, who asked specific questions and waited for specific answers, who had arrived on the second day with a copy of a report she had submitted to the village council 2 years ago. He had found it somehow in the council records and read it, and who had opened the conversation by saying, "You were right about the roof. The council should have acted sooner." She had looked at him. "Yes," she had said, "they should have." And he had smiled, a real smile, brief and slightly self-aware, and said, "I imagine you've been told that less often than you've been right." She had found, to her considerable inconvenience, that she could not be entirely indifferent to a man who said things like that. By the second week, the visits had expanded beyond the school. They walked. She had suggested it, because sitting on the bench outside the school, with the children periodically appearing in the doorway to report things, was not ideal for substantive conversation. Along the lane that ran past the church and the mill, and the edge of the Ashby parkland. And they talked. About the school at first, then about the village more broadly, then, by degrees, about other things. The state of rural education generally. The question of whether the new agricultural methods were helping or harming the smaller farmers. The book she was currently reading. The book he was currently not reading because he had not had time for 3 months and found this more irritating than he had expected to. She lent him the book. He returned it 4 days later with annotations in the margins. She read the annotations with the focused attention of someone encountering a mind that interested her, and arrived at the conclusion she had been resisting for 2 weeks. She liked him. Genuinely, specifically, not as a category of useful patron, but as a person, the particular person he was. She liked his directness and his attention and the quality of his silences. which were the silences of someone thinking rather than someone waiting for their turn to speak. This was, she told herself, entirely irrelevant. He was a duke. She was a schoolteacher. These were facts, and she was very good with facts, and the fact of the distance between them was not going to be wished away by a fortnight of excellent conversations and annotated margins. She was reminding herself of this, firmly and with complete conviction, on the Thursday of the third week, when she passed two women on the road outside the village and heard quite clearly what they said to each other. They did not lower their voices. She did not think they intended to. She kept walking. She kept her chin level. She did not let her pace change. And she thought, there it is. There is the thing that is actually true about this situation, stated plainly by people who have no reason to soften it. She was beneath him. Everyone knew it. The only question was whether she was going to let herself forget it. It happened at the Pemberton dinner. Eleanor had not been invited to the Pemberton dinner. She was not, under normal circumstances, the kind of person the Pembertons invited to dinner. Their social circle ran to the families of the immediate gentry and the occasional distinguished visitor, and a village schoolteacher, however well regarded locally, did not generally feature. She had been invited this time because Mrs. Pemberton, who was a practical woman underneath her social ambitions, wanted to discuss the possibility of establishing a small lending library in the village hall, and had decided that consulting Eleanor was the most efficient path to a workable plan. The invitation was for the early part of the evening, before the formal dinner, and was understood by both parties to be professional rather than social. Eleanor arrived at the appropriate time, discussed the library with appropriate thoroughness, and was preparing to leave when the other guests began to arrive, including the Duke of Harrow. He saw her from across the entrance hall. She saw him see her. Something moved in his face, something she could not quite name, but which was warm and immediate and slightly too visible to be entirely safe. He crossed the hall to her. "Miss Voss," he said. "Your Grace." She kept her voice pleasant, neutral. "I was just leaving." "Stay," he said, simply, quietly, with the directness that characterized everything about him. "I wasn't invited for dinner." "You are now. I'll speak to Mrs. Pemberton." "Your Grace." But he had already turned, and Mrs. Pemberton, who was not immune to the influence of a duke's preference, had already rearranged her seating with the swift efficiency of a woman who understood where her interests lay. Eleanor stayed. She sat 3 places from him at the dinner table and was aware of him with the constant, low-level precision of a compass needle aware of north. She talked to her neighbours, Sir James Whitfield on her left, who was pleasant enough, and Lady Whitfield on her right, who was not unpleasant, but who looked at Eleanor with the particular quality of a woman calculating how this particular piece had ended up at this particular table. After dinner, in the drawing-room, it happened. She was standing slightly apart from the main group, her natural position in these settings, the edge of the room, when she heard the conversation near the fireplace. Lady Constance Hervey, whose family had an estate 3 miles from Alveston, and who had been one of the women on the road that Thursday, was speaking in the carrying undertone of a person who intends to be overheard by some people and not others. "It's quite extraordinary," Lady Constance was saying. "He's been calling on her for 3 weeks. The school teacher. Can you imagine? She is entirely beneath him, of course. Everyone says so. Her father was a clergyman who died in debt. She has nothing, no family, no connections, no— I beg your pardon." The voice was quiet, very quiet, the kind of quiet that is actually louder than any volume. The room went still. Edmund Ashby was standing at the edge of the fireplace group. He had not, Eleanor realized, been there a moment ago. He had moved across the room, and no one had quite tracked it. He was looking at Lady Constance with an expression that Eleanor had not seen on him before. Still the composure she had come to know, but underneath it something with a different quality, something decided. "She is beneath you," Lady Constance said again, with less certainty than before, but with the stiff dignity of a woman who has gone too far to retreat gracefully. "Surely you must see that. A school teacher. It is simply not—" "Miss Voss," Edmund said, without looking away from Lady Constance, "is the finest person in this room." The silence was absolute. Lady Constance stared at him. He held her gaze with the complete, unhurried steadiness of a man who has made up his mind and is not interested in revising it. "She is beneath you," Lady Constance said again, more quietly now, almost a question. Edmund Ashby turned to find Eleanor across the room, where she had been standing very still, with something happening in her chest that she could not account for. He looked at her directly. "Then," he said, with the quietest and most certain voice she had ever heard, "I shall kneel." The room did not breathe. Eleanor looked at him, at the man who had come back to a village he had no particular reason to return to, who had sat on a bench for 45 minutes and written in her book's margins and ordered spectacles for a child he had never met, who was standing in a drawing room in front of witnesses and saying the truest and most dangerous thing anyone had ever said on her behalf. She thought, "I have been holding myself very carefully for 3 weeks, and I am not sure I can do it anymore." She thought, "He means it." She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him. "You are going to cause an enormous amount of difficulty," she said, very quietly. "I know," he said. "I am not going to make this easy for you." "I have never," he said, "wanted easy." Eleanor Voss, who had spent 4 years being sensible, and 4 years before that being practical, and 4 years before that surviving, looked at Edmund Ashby and made a decision. "Walk me home," she said. He offered her his arm. They left together. Behind them, the drawing room erupted. The night was clear and cold, the September stars very bright above the lane that led from Pemberton House back through the village to Eleanor's cottage. They walked without speaking for a while. The silence had a different quality now than their usual silences. Those had been the silences of two people thinking in comfortable proximity. This one was the silence of two people who had just stepped off a cliff together and were still in the air, waiting to find out what came next. Eleanor spoke first. "That was very public," she said. "Yes." "Lady Constance will tell everyone." "Yes." "The story will be in every drawing room in the county by Saturday." "Almost certainly." She looked at the lane ahead of them. The village was quiet, late enough that most people were inside, early enough that the lights were still lit in the cottage windows. She had walked this lane hundreds of times, alone, in every season, and it had always felt like her lane, her village, her quiet, ordinary life. It felt different tonight. "I need you to understand something," she said. "Tell me." "I have spent 4 years building something here. The school, the trust of the families, my position in this village, which is tenuous in certain respects, but is mine, and which I have worked for." She paused. "I am not going to abandon any of it because you said something dramatic in a drawing room." "I would not ask you to," he said. "I am also not going to be swept into something I haven't thought about properly because you are—" She stopped. "Because I am?" he prompted. She glanced at him. "Because you are very difficult to think clearly around," she said, with the bluntness she used when she could not find a more comfortable way to say the true thing. "I want you to know that I am aware of that, and I am attempting to account for it." Something shifted in his face, the warmth she had been watching for 3 weeks surfacing. "I will tell you something," he said. "I was in Alveston 3 years ago." A wheel rattle, 15 minutes. "I was standing outside the coaching inn and I saw you on the village green." He paused. "I saw what those women said to you. I watched you stand in the middle of the green and hold yourself together and keep walking, and I thought, I have never seen anyone do something that hard, that quietly." Eleanor was still. "I did not stop to speak to you. I did not know your name. I drove north and I told myself I had forgotten it." He looked at the lane ahead of them. "I had not forgotten it. I thought about you for 3 years without knowing why. And when the school endowment report came across my desk with the name Alveston on it and the name Eleanor Voss beneath it, I understood." Eleanor absorbed this. "That is," she said carefully, "a great deal to tell someone on a September evening." "I have been waiting 3 years to tell someone." They had reached the gate of her cottage. She stopped and looked at it, the small, clean, well-ordered life she had built in there, the books and the lamp and the lesson plans on the kitchen table. She turned. "I need time," she said. "I am not telling you no. I am telling you that I need to think. Without the drawing room and without," she gestured slightly helplessly at him, "the proximity of you, which does not assist clear thinking." He looked at her steadily. "How much time?" "A week." "A week," he agreed. "I'll call on Thursday." "You'll call on Thursday," she said, "and I will have thought properly by then, and I will tell you what I think." "And if what you think is no?" She looked at him directly. "Then I will tell you no, and I will tell you why, and you will respect it." "Yes," he said, simply. "And if what I think is not no?" He held her gaze. "Then we will have a great deal to discuss," he said, "and a considerable amount of difficulty to face, and I would like very much to face it." Eleanor looked at him for one long, still moment. Then she opened the gate and went inside. She sat at her kitchen table for a long time, with the lesson plans she could not focus on, and the lamp burning low, and the September stars outside the window. She thought very carefully, and somewhere around midnight, she arrived at the conclusion she had probably known since a man sat on a bench outside her school and waited 45 minutes without complaint. Thursday, she thought, was a long way away. She had asked for a week without proximity. She had not accounted for the fact that Alveston was a small village, and that small villages do not permit the absence of proximity. She encountered his steward at the market on Wednesday, who raised his hat and informed her with careful neutrality that the spectacles for young Thomas Briggs had arrived from the optician and were waiting at the estate office whenever she wished to collect them. She thanked him. She walked home with her basket and thought about a man who had ordered spectacles for a child he had met twice. She encountered Mrs. Pemberton on Thursday morning, before the appointed hour, who stopped her in the street with the expression of a woman who had clearly been rehearsing the conversation. "My dear Miss Voss," Mrs. Pemberton said, with a delicacy that barely concealed its urgency, "I want you to know that I thought the Duke's behaviour last evening was entirely... that is to say, it was not... it was kind," Eleanor said. Mrs. Pemberton blinked. "It was honest," Eleanor continued, "which is rarer. Thank you for the library conversation, Mrs. Pemberton. I think it is a very good plan, and I would like to move forward with it." She walked on. She encountered Lady Constance on Friday afternoon, which was less comfortable. Lady Constance had the slightly complicated expression of a woman who has said something she cannot unsay and is not entirely sure whether to defend it or retreat from it. Eleanor stopped. "Lady Constance," she said. Lady Constance gathered herself. "Miss Voss, I hope you do not think that I intended any particular—" "I think," Eleanor said very evenly, "that you said what you believed to be true in a room full of people you thought would agree with you. I think you were surprised to be wrong." She paused. "I also think that the things you said about my father were unkind, and that he was a better man than his debts suggest, and that I would prefer if you did not speak of him that way again." Lady Constance was very still. "Yes," she said after a moment, quietly. "I suppose that is fair." Eleanor nodded once and walked on. She encountered the children every day, of course, as she always did. 32 faces that had nothing to do with any of this, and everything to do with why she was here. Thomas Briggs, on Friday, collected his spectacles and put them on, and looked at the blackboard and said, with the complete unself-conscious wonder of a 9-year-old encountering clarity for the first time, Oh, it's all just there." Eleanor sat down at her desk after the children left and held herself very still for a moment. She thought about a man who had written to an optician. She thought, "I have been alone in this for 4 years." Not unhappily alone. She had the children and the work and the village and her books, but alone in the specific sense of doing everything by herself, carrying everything herself. There being no one who looked at what she was doing and thought, "I want to help carry that." She thought, "He wants to help carry it." She thought, "I am going to say yes on Thursday." She had reached this conclusion by Tuesday evening. The remaining days were spent not reconsidering, but simply inhabiting the decision, letting it settle, making sure it felt as true on Wednesday morning as it had on Tuesday night. It did. Thursday arrived. He was precisely on time. He knocked at 5 minutes past 12, which was slightly more precise than punctual, and which she found, for some reason, endearing. She opened the door. He was in riding clothes. He had come on horseback, not by carriage, which meant he had come simply and directly, without the apparatus of his position arranged around him. She noted this. "Come in," she said. The cottage was small. She had always thought of it as adequately sized for her life, and for her life it was, but with Edmund Ashby in it, the proportions changed. Not uncomfortably, but noticeably, the way a room changes when it becomes occupied rather than merely inhabited. She had made tea. She set it on the table and sat down, and he sat across from her, and the light came through the south window, which was the best window, and fell across the small room. She said, "I have thought carefully." "I know you have," he said. "I am going to tell you what I have decided, but first I want to tell you what I have been thinking, because I think you should understand all of it." He waited. She had always appreciated that he waited. "I have spent 4 years being told in various ways that I am not quite enough," she said. "Not the right family, not the right money, not the right position. I have become very good at not caring what people say, and I mostly don't care, and I am not going to pretend that what Lady Constance said in that drawing room wounded me, because I have heard its equivalent many times, and I have a great deal of practice." She paused. "But I want to tell you that I do not want to spend the rest of my life being the thing that someone overlooked the social expectations to choose. I do not want to be a decision that requires justification. I do not want someone who is brave about me. I want someone who doesn't experience choosing me as an act of courage." He looked at her steadily. "Then I need to tell you something." "Tell me." "What I said in the drawing room," he said, "was not brave. I want you to understand that. It was not a sacrifice, or a defiance, or an act of principle against the expectations of my class." He leaned forward slightly. "It was simply true. She said you were beneath me, and I said I would kneel. And I meant both things. I meant that the premise was wrong, and I meant the response. Not because overcoming the premise required courage, but because the response was the accurate one." He paused. "You are not someone I am choosing in spite of anything. You are someone I am choosing because of everything. Those are entirely different statements." The cottage was very quiet. "Because of everything," Eleanor said slowly. "Because you told me to wait 45 minutes, and you were right to. Because you talked about 32 children by name, and I understood that each name was a world you had been paying careful attention to. Because you lent me a book, and I could not stop reading it. And when I found the margins, I thought, yes, this is the mind I want to argue with for the rest of my life." He held her gaze. "Because you stood on a village green 3 years ago and held yourself together in a way that I have never forgotten, and that I think was one of the bravest things I have ever seen. And you would not describe it that way, because for you it was simply what was necessary." Eleanor said nothing. "I am not brave about you," he said quietly. "I am certain about you. That is a different thing entirely." She looked at him across the small table in the small room, with the September light coming in and the tea neither of them had touched, and 32 children in her heart, and 4 years of a life she had built from nothing. And she thought, yes. Not carefully, not with the methodical precision she had promised herself. Simply, yes. "I have decided," she said, "not to say no." Something moved in his face, the relief and the warmth and the thing underneath that she had been watching build for 3 weeks. "That is," he said, "the most characteristic yes I have ever received." "It is accurate," she said. "I have decided not to say no. I have also decided that I am keeping the school, of course, and that I will not be decorative, God forbid, and that you are going to have to read the annotations I made in that book properly, because I think you were entirely wrong about the 3rd chapter." He smiled, fully, openly, the smile she had seen only in glimpses, and that was, she thought, the most honest thing about him. "I read them 4 times, he said. "I was wrong about the 3rd chapter." Eleanor picked up her tea. "All right then," she said. Outside the cottage window, Alveston went about its day, and inside it, something began. Society did not take it quietly. Eleanor had expected this. She had prepared for it with the methodical thoroughness she applied to everything, had catalogued the probable responses and the probable sources and the probable escalation, and had decided that she would manage it the way she managed everything, directly, practically, and without losing sleep. She had underestimated the volume. The story had spread, exactly as she predicted, from Lady Constance's account of the drawing room to the surrounding county. and then, within a fortnight, to London. Carried there by the guests who had been present at the Pemberton dinner, and who had found that the story of the Duke of Harrow saying, "I shall kneel in a Wiltshire drawing room," was exactly the kind of story that London could not resist. The responses divided roughly into 3 categories. The first category found it romantic. Younger women, overwhelmingly, and a surprising number of men who had been married long enough to find the idea of decisive feeling appealing. Letters arrived at Ashby Park. Edmund showed her one with some amusement, from people he had barely met, congratulating him on having done the right thing, and assuring him that they had always thought the class distinctions around marriage were excessive. The second category found it foolish. Older women, mostly, and men of his father's generation, who wrote with the genuine concern of people who believed that the social structure was a thing maintained by everyone's compliance, and that exceptions, however romantic in the moment, had consequences. These letters Edmund did not show her, but she knew they existed. She had her own version. The conversations that stopped when she walked into the village shop, the altered quality of certain greetings, the handful of families in the surrounding area whose warmth cooled perceptibly. The third category was his family. His mother, the Dowager Duchess, arrived at Ashby Park on a Friday in October without prior notice, which Edmund told Eleanor about with the slightly too controlled expression of a man who had expected this and had not been entirely prepared. "She wants to meet you," he said. "Of course she does," Eleanor said. "I want you to know that what she thinks does not, Edmund." She looked at him steadily. "I am not afraid of your mother." He looked at her. "All right," he said. "Saturday at noon." The Dowager Duchess of Harrow was 71 years old, small, immaculately dressed, and possessed of the kind of eyes that had been observing the world for 7 decades and had very strong opinions about what they saw. She looked at Eleanor for a long time without speaking. Eleanor looked back. "My son," the Dowager said finally, "has not brought a woman to this house in 11 years. "I know," Eleanor said. "He was engaged once. She died. He has been careful since." "I know that too. He is not a careful man by nature. He had to learn it." The Dowager was quiet for a moment. "He has been less careful lately. I notice these things." She tilted her head. "You are a school teacher." "I am." "You intend to remain one?" "Yes." The Dowager looked at her with the assessing quality of a woman who had sized up a great many people in her life. "My son said, when he told me about you, that you were the finest person he had ever met." A pause. "Edmund does not say things he does not mean." "No," Eleanor agreed. "He doesn't." "He also said," the Dowager paused, and something shifted in her expression, something that was almost, around the edges, amused, "that you told him he was entirely wrong about the 3rd chapter of whatever it is you lent him, and that he conceded you were right." "He was wrong," Eleanor said. "Edmund," the Dowager said, "has not conceded he was wrong about anything to anyone in 11 years. She looked at Eleanor for one more long moment. "Tell me about the school." Eleanor told her. She talked for 40 minutes. The Dowager listened with the focused attention that Eleanor recognized, had always recognized, she realized, because she had seen it in the son first. When Eleanor finished, the Dowager was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to visit the school, if you would permit it." Eleanor looked at her. "Saturday afternoons," she said. "The children would enjoy it." The Dowager nodded once. "Good," she said. And that, essentially, was that?
They were married in November in the village church at Alveston, which was the only location Eleanor had considered for even a moment. Edmund had suggested, with the careful diplomacy of a man navigating between his own preferences and social expectation, that a larger ceremony might be, and she had said no before he finished the sentence, pleasantly but with complete finality. And he had said, "All right," and that had been the end of that. The church was full. Every family in the village was there. The farmers and the tradespeople and the children from the school who had been released from their lessons for the occasion and who occupied the first 3 pews with the barely contained energy of 32 people who had been told to be on their best behaviour and were making a significant effort. Thomas Briggs, in the second pew, was wearing his spectacles. He had worn them every day since they arrived. He had told Eleanor on the first day that everything looked different with them, that the world looked like it had been cleaned. She had thought about this for a long time afterward. The idea that something so small could change the quality of everything a person saw. She thought about it again now, standing at the door of the church with the November light coming flat and clear across the village green, across the spot where she had stood 3 years ago and held herself together. The green looked different today. Mrs. Pemberton was inside, near the front. The Dowager Duchess was in the 3rd row from the front, very upright, and wearing what Eleanor suspected was her best hat. Lady Constance Hervey was present too, had requested to be, in a brief, awkward and not entirely graceless note that Eleanor had received 2 weeks ago, which she had appreciated more than she had expected to. She walked in alone, as she had always intended. Edmund turned when she reached him. His face did the thing she had learned to expect and never tired of seeing. The unguarded, wandering thing. The thing that said, "There you are." She stopped beside him. "Hello," she said very quietly. "Hello," he said. The vicar began. Outside, the village went about its November morning, and inside the church, the Duke of Harrow and the schoolteacher of Alveston made the promises that would make them each other's. And the children in the first 3 pews were very nearly on their best behaviour, and Thomas Briggs looked at everything through clean, clear glass. The school at Alveston became, in the year that followed, something of a model. This was not Eleanor's doing alone. She would have been the first to say so. The endowment had made it possible to extend the hours and add a second teacher, a young woman from the village whom Eleanor had been training for 2 years and who had been waiting patiently for the resources to make a proper position possible. New materials, a repaired floor and the eastern window that had been leaking since Eleanor's first winter. The lending library in the village hall, which Mrs. Pemberton had organised with great efficiency and which had more members than anyone had anticipated. 3 neighbouring villages sent delegations to see it. Edmund had managed this with the quiet efficiency he brought to everything, arranging the visits, making the introductions, ensuring that the model was understood as Eleanor's and not his, which she had asked for specifically and which he had honoured without discussion. He was, she had found in the year of their marriage, exactly what the 3 weeks before it had suggested. Precise and patient, and fundamentally kind in the way that showed up not in declarations, but in actions, in the endowment details and the optician's bill, and the way he listened completely every time she spoke. They argued regularly and productively about books and policy and the best management of the South Field and the correct placement of the natural philosophy section in the Ashby Park Library, which was also, now, partly hers. She had kept the school. She had also,
with the particular pleasure of a person given proper resources for the first time, been building something else, the beginning of a curriculum that she wanted to share with other village schools. A written guide to what had worked in Alveston and why. Something that could travel beyond the village and be of use to people she would never meet. Edmund had read the first draft and written 23 pages of notes. She had incorporated 14 of them and told him he was wrong about the other 9. He had said she was probably right about 7 of them. It was, she thought, a very good marriage. On a November morning, 1 year from the wedding, she had established the habit of walking the village green early before the school day in every season. She stood in the spot where she had stood 3 years before, when the words had been said and she had held herself together and kept walking. She stood there for a moment. She thought about the girl who had stood in this spot, who had been so practiced at survival that she had confused it with living, who had been alone for so long that she had stopped noticing. She thought she was not wrong to be careful. She was right to be careful. The carefulness had kept her whole, but there came a time to put it down. There came a time when someone looked at you across a room and said the true thing, and you had to decide whether to let it matter. She was glad she had let it matter. She turned and walked back across the green toward the school where 32 children were arriving in the pale November morning, carrying their books and their noise and their particular urgent aliveness. Thomas Briggs waved at her from the gate. She waved back. The Duke of Harrow, who had come early to walk with her and had been waiting at the edge of the green with his hands in his pockets and the patient expression of a man who was entirely comfortable waiting, fell into step beside her. "Ready?" he said. She looked at the school, at the village, at the green behind them and the lane ahead. "Yes," she said. And she was.